Welcome everybody. This is the second panel that we have done in this digital series. Today we're going to be talking about imagining car use and road safety post COVID-19. Today we're in conversation with a panel of experts to discuss international examples, such as Milan's proposal to permanently relocate street space from cars to cycling and walking following the COVID-19 crisis, what this could look like in a Canadian context, and how we can all advocate for changes. There's certainly a lot of discussion happening about this issue and debate about designing our communities for multimodal transportation that works better for everybody, including drivers. Before we begin, I want to thank our partners at Desjardins Insurance for supporting our Vision Zero programming and for their long-term commitment to our work on road safety. We couldn't do these kinds of things without them. So a few items to cover before I introduce our panelists. There's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Those of you who are participants can submit questions throughout the webinar, and we'll use those questions during the Q&A component. We are recording this webinar and it will be made available on Parachute's website. So let me get right into introducing our panel. Today we have Rachel MacCleery, Senior Vice President at the Urban Land Institute and lead of the Building Healthy Places Initiative, coming to us from Washington, D.C. Her projects have focused on reimagining urban corridors, healthy housing, active transportation, food, and other intersections between health and wellness and development practice. Rachel was also previously a consultant for infrastructure projects in Northeast China. Robin Mazumder, Vanier scholar and urban neuroscientist from Waterloo, Ontario. Robin is an award-winning researcher and accomplished keynote speaker. He is currently completing his doctorate in cognitive neuroscience at the University of Waterloo, where he is studying the psychological impacts of urban design. And we have Craig Milligan, road safety engineer and CEO at MicroTraffic, located in Winnipeg, Manitoba. Craig is an expert road safety engineer applying a proactive safe systems approach to Vision Zero. He has authored over 30 road safety publications and has a PhD in civil engineering focused on road safety. So welcome to all of our panelists. Rachel, maybe I'll begin with you and ask each of you to give us a brief outline of your connection to your urban planning and design.
Yeah, sure. So I'm Rachel MacCleery and I manage ULI's Building Healthy Places program. So for folks that aren't familiar with ULI, it's a research and education nonprofit supported by our members. So globally we have over 40,000 members who are all involved in some facet of real estate or the land use industry. We have quite a robust chapter in Toronto, if anybody is interested in checking it out. ULI is very cross-disciplinary, but we have a bit of a private sector focus, so really thinking about how the development community and the real estate community can play a role in building more thriving and sustainable communities. And the organization launched Building Healthy Places in 2013 out of a recognition that real estate shapes place and place shapes health, and urban planning and sort of public health are historically connected. I've been leading up Building Healthy Places since then, and I think the coronavirus pandemic has made health much more front of mind for the real estate industry and for our members globally. So I personally consider myself a planner. I've got a specific focus on transportation and infrastructure planning. I worked for DC government for 4 years after grad school, and as you mentioned, I worked in China, and I live in DC obviously, but I have a deep tie to Canada. So my family were loyalists way back during the Revolutionary War, and we still have a summer camp in New Brunswick, Canada, along the St. John River, just outside of St. John. So I know a bit about Canada, and I admire a lot about Canadian cities. As you mentioned, ULI has done a lot of work on active transportation and including ways that real estate can support biking and walking. And we also have a new report coming out in June, which I'd be happy to share with all of these attendees, called Pavement to Parks, which is looking at how cities are transforming and converting road space and parking lots and parking garages into park spaces. So that's a little bit about me.
Excellent, thanks. Craig, maybe you can go next.
Sure. So I'm connected to this as a road safety engineer with MicroTraffic. We're mainly involved in helping cities diagnose risk on their corridors and intersections for all road users through near-miss analysis of videos. And outside of that, working as a consulting safety engineer, I work on road safety audits for corridors and intersection designs and intersection safety reviews all the time. So we're in the managing risk aspect of things, in tackling the challenges that are particular with active transportation, where the sample size is quite low at individual locations. So it's hard to know the risk if you're using historical crash data. So that's where MicroTraffic's AI-based video analytics platform comes in. And just I was interested in hearing about DC. I did the most biking I ever did in DC when I worked for the World Bank. I had a 10-mile or 16-kilometer commute from Bethesda into downtown DC, and I was in great shape when I did that. And it was along a beautiful path along the Potomac River. So maybe you're
yeah. Yeah.
Great, thanks. And Robin, maybe you can talk, just do a brief introduction of your connection to this issue.
Sure. Like you mentioned, I am currently doing my PhD in cognitive neuroscience, where I look at the psychological impacts of urban design. But that interest was really inspired by my previous clinical work as an occupational therapist, where I worked in community mental health with a number of populations with people with mental health issues like schizophrenia, depression, and anxiety, and across a lifespan, so with kids to older adults. And it was in that work where I really started to wonder about how it was that the built environment of the city impacted well-being. Occupational therapists take particular interest in obviously occupations, which are the things that we do to occupy our time with, but we understand the implications, or we try to understand the implications of how the environment, whether it's a social environment or the built environment, affects someone's ability to participate in those activities. And so I did that for about 5 years, and then my interest in that question grew so much that I quit my job to start my PhD, which I'm doing at the University of Waterloo. And for that, I use a number of methods to understand how people experience the built environment. So we use wearable technology that tells us what is happening on a physiological level. We use psychological questionnaires to get some of the more subjective experiences and to expose people to these different environments. We do stuff in the real world. So a couple of years ago, we ran a study in collaboration with the City of Vancouver, the Happy City Consultancy, and Modus Planning, where we looked at how people experienced Davie Village and some spots around Davie Village to look at how different types of urban interventions like community gardens or rainbow crosswalks would affect people's sense of well-being. And that was published in an academic journal, but there's also a report for the public that you can find on the Happy City website. It's called the Happy Streets Living Lab report. I also do research in virtual reality. So I take 360-degree videos of urban environments and then bring it back and put someone in a VR headset, which allows us for a bit more experimental control to understand what the specific variables are. Anyways, all of that has really made me interested in a larger capacity in advocating for better urban design, because I've seen, have my own experiences as someone who doesn't own a car and sees how the built environment of a city can affect us. But, so the research is increasingly showing that we need to pay more attention to how our cities are designed if we want to, ensure that everyone who lives in our cities are well.
Great, thanks. Really interesting use of technology to understand that space, and we're happy to have your perspective from a, from a psychological perspective versus a built environment, but they all, are intricately connected. So I'll pose this question and give each of you a chance to answer. And maybe we'll start with you, Rachel, in terms of, what we have seen internationally, the city's response to the pandemic in terms of reallocating road space to pedestrians and cyclists. What has stood out to you the most, and why?
Well, I think there's a lot of cities that are being really nimble and adaptive, and doing really innovative things. Some small scale, some larger, and cities are really trying new things in a variety of realms. And I really think that, these times call for creativity and a strong focus on equity. And we need to be careful about simply shutting down city life, and to think about, how city life can actually shift to the outdoors, to communal spaces, to parks and streets, and use spaces in ways that they maybe haven't been used before. And then also to use the pandemic to accelerate more long-term shifts. So, in the United States, some cities that sort of stand out are Seattle, which has made 20 miles of closed streets permanent, and Oakland. They have opened over 74 miles of temporary open streets. Philly has opened MLK Drive. We actually had a speaker from the Parks Department, and they're talking about doing more. In Europe, you mentioned Milan at the start of the hour. I think they're interesting. They're really working to accelerate in just a year or two. Plans are on the books to be completed by 2030. So really embracing the opportunity. And then, of course, in Europe, lots of cities have pretty good infrastructure for biking and walking to start with. Madrid was already closing down the city center. So you have the sort of the good foundations. It makes it a little bit easier to pivot. So, I think the innovations around street space are really exciting, and people need room to move. And when people can eat in restaurants again, they'll need room to dine, and, sidewalks and street space are obvious places to move some of those activities.
Yeah, Craig, what has stood out for you as you've been, watching what's been happening globally and as well as across Canada and North America?
Yeah, I think that Rachel just mentioned about Seattle, and I think that was interesting in that they were one of the ones that kind of quickly seized on the concept to make it permanent. So, and I think that's important leadership, right? Like, where they had a vision of what a new reality could be, and they kind of seized on that. And I think that some cities are gonna, get a glimpse of a different kind of reality. It'll be hard to imagine otherwise, but it won't seize on it, and that's going to be, to their detriment. And to Seattle's credit, New York was interesting in that the nimbleness and the perseverance. So I was initially concerned because they had, I don't know if people know, but New York kind of had a false start. They reallocated some space and then canceled it, very shortly after that. But then they kind of worked it out a bit more, and not long after that, then they came out with another plan. And the first plan was only 1.5 miles. After the next plan was more than 100 miles. And I think that that was interesting to sit out, you're not going to get it right the first time. And especially when you go so fast, it could come out a bit messy, and you may have to pull back and restart. One other thing, probably one of the most dramatic things I've seen, which is not a direct, immediate reallocation of space, was the UK announcing their 2 billion British pound investment, close to 3.5 billion Canadian dollars. And they kind of set aside 5 billion for investment in transit infrastructure. And now all of a sudden, packing all these people on the subways, even new subways, the feasibility of that's just kind of evaporated overnight. And to pull 2 of that 5 billion and say we're going to do it for the biggest cycling investment program that's ever existed in the history of the world anywhere, is very impressive, and even more impressive because the UK has an extremely low mode share for cycling. It's a place where you could say like it can't be done. One article I read was suggesting UK cycling mode share has been flat for 17 years at under 2%. And they're going to put $2 billion into lifting that up. It's not impossible to get to a higher mode share. Like countries around them have much higher, almost 50% mode share. And they can do it too, and they're going to seize on this very almost once in a lifetime opportunity to make it happen. So I really respect that. There are a few others, but I'll kind of pause there. I'm really excited looking around, seeing what's happening and what's going on.
Yeah, I get that sense of commitment for sure. Robin, do you want to tell us what I know you've been living over abroad. What do you see some of the cities that have made some of these changes? What have stood out for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the cities that I've been a big fan of have been mentioned already, but to this morning, I think CityCon, who's the mayor of London, just announced that they're going to be closing the center of London to cars, which makes it, I think, the largest urban center in the world or Europe or something like that, that will be closed to cars, which I think is quite impressive. And like I mentioned, I was living in London. I left on March 21st. And the whole time I was there, I was thinking to myself that the city needs to do much better when it comes to what they provide for cyclists. The roads there are typically pretty narrow, and I mostly got around my bike, and I was squeezed out by giant lorries more than I would have liked to have been. And I think something else to consider when it comes to this conversation, particularly in a city like London. The other thing I noticed about London, I was living in the center in London, in Bloomsbury and Camden, and the quality of the air is terrible. As a Canadian who grew up in Victoria, BC, on the West Coast, and had a steady flow of fresh ocean air to breathe, it was almost disgusting to me how terrible. I could like taste the air, and London has issues with air pollution to the extent that it's causing asthma. I think a couple of years ago, there was a young girl who was, I think, 12, who had died of air pollution related pulmonary complications, and they actually, I think, they petitioned to change the cause for death to air pollution. And when we're looking at something like COVID, which is a pulmonary disease, in conjunction with air pollution, I think there's legitimate fear around the implications of all of that combined from like a systems approach. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think, like everyone mentioned, Milan and I think Paris, like Anne Hidalgo is setting an amazing example for political will and leadership. And I think the last thing I'll just say is that, as someone who considers himself to be a cycling advocate or an advocate for safer streets, a big frustration of mine, particularly in Canadian cities, is, here's a 30-year cycling master plan, and, change takes time, and we can't do things right away. But I think people's excuses are going to be running out pretty quick here, as we're being seen how quickly, cities can transform their urban landscapes to support the well-being of their residents.
Yeah, it's a good point. And Rachel, the next question I think that follows from that of what they're doing, what these cities and places are doing well, is there's certain characteristics that and the speed with which they're putting these new things into place, like cycling lanes and space for pedestrians and closing roads. How likely are some of these to continue? Like, how sustainable might these be, that we're going to see maybe a permanent shift in this commuting culture of, more people choosing to cycle or walk? I've heard some talk about, changing the land uses depending on the time of day or day of the week. And, so that it's a little more flexible, there's some opportunities for that. Because I think what I'm hearing too from all of you is that, the pendulum might have swung way to the other side of the curve. And maybe we need to, think a little more sustainably about how this works post-COVID, and that there is phases, of course, that we're going to go through. What are your thoughts on, you know, the sustainability of some of these changes that are being made?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think, you know, there's lots of cities that are doing important things and are moving quickly. And then I also think there's a lot of cities that we all know that really probably aren't, you know, thinking creatively about the use of their space. I think where I live in Washington, D.C., you know, Craig's experience bicycling notwithstanding, you know, I think, could do more to promote more multimodal street usage. And actually, on the flip side, you know, in the short term, I think what we're seeing in some cases where there haven't been operational changes is that cars are even more deadly and moving even quicker because there isn't as much traffic. And so, Craig, I wonder if, you know, you've seen accidents increasing and things like that in places where, you know, streets haven't really slowed. So I hope, you know, as Robin said, that people's sort of eyes are open to the different possibilities of street usage. I think in most cities, streets and automobile-oriented uses make up a third of land. There's 8 parking spaces for every 1 car. There's a lot of land out there that's devoted to the automobile that could really be put to more productive uses. And I think it's not just the real estate, you know, I think it's also thinking about, like, as you mentioned, thinking about how uses or operations might shift at different times of the day, how we give time to people. So I've heard of some cities that are increasing the time that's allotted for pedestrian crossings, for example, or you know, changing the way that pedestrians cross the streets to reduce mixing and congestion. There's a thing called a barn dance where you can just let everybody sort of all the pedestrians can have access to the intersection at the same time, and it's much more efficient. And so, you know, just sort of shifting priorities and shifting assumptions about the way that cities work. I think will be really important going forward. And I'll also say, you know, I think maybe Canadian cities are a little bit less acutely affected by this, but in America, and we're heading into, you know, really the dog days of summer. And so that heat and thinking about strategies for mitigating heat, especially with a lot of public pools closed, will be really important. And, you know, there's parking garages that could be turned into skate parks or tennis courts, or, you know, other kinds of uses where there might be shade and things. So I think it'll be really important for people to look at existing infrastructure with new eyes, both from a use perspective and from a time perspective.
Yeah, Craig, you know, from a road safety, from an engineering perspective, you know, some of these are quite, you know, slapped together. I mean, some of the temporary, you know, allocations to pedestrians look almost more dangerous than, you know, staying on the regular sidewalks. You know, how are you feeling in terms of the sustainability of some of these changes?
I think, yeah, if they're made safe, they can stay. You know, if they've been hastily put together, then they shouldn't stay as they are. That doesn't mean they can't stay without modification. So one thing that, like, a lot of people feel like this is a moment for tactical urbanism to rise up, right? Where you can just, you know, quickly rapidly go do something that the engineers always said takes a long time to plan, right? And I think a good balance is sometime in the middle. There are quite a few considerations going to make sure that when a reallocation of space happens, it happens in a safe way, right? Drivers make mistakes, okay? So their ability to stay in their lane without encroaching laterally outside of it is limited, and they will make mistakes in that. So what's going to happen? Are they going to plow into a bunch of people or not? How fast will they be going? And how will we have kind of introduced features that would maybe manage that speed and reduce that likelihood? What happens when they need to make a turn across this new reallocated space? to enter a driveway or to turn right at an intersection. These conflict points have to be managed. The sight lines have to be taken care of. And you know, for those lateral encroachments, is it just a paint line? That's not going to stop many vehicles. Is it pylons? That's also not going to stop them. So what kind of like rigid, you know, more rigid physical barriers are protecting those vulnerable road users? So I think cities will want to take a look and say, is it safe? And something that may be safe now when there's almost no traffic might not be safe when the traffic starts to pick back up. The other thing for making things permanent, I feel like the reallocation of space can always be a contentious issue, but when active transportation facilities are used a lot, okay, there's less argument about whether they should be there or whether that space should be handed over to the cars. Mm-hmm. And I think that a lot of these spaces, you know, we'll see the ones that are used a lot are going to have a better chance of staying permanent, while the other ones, I think the pressure to reallocate back to vehicles will win out, especially if there's a traffic jam. This thing also, you know, there's a proven effect of safety in numbers, right? So if the more people that get out there and feel safe and use it, the more likely it's going to stay, and the more likely it's going to be safe, because drivers, when they're turning right, they're going to be thinking about the pedestrians and the cyclists and so on, because they're always there and it's not a surprise to them. So yeah, in short, I think a lot of careful consideration is going to have to go into it. And there's places like NACTO are putting out a lot of resources about how to do this safely. They already have good resources on this stuff, and they've introduced new ones for the more kind of rapid ones, rapid efforts. Another guide I really like that just came out, and I posted a link to it on MicroTraffic's LinkedIn page, is a guide on safe accommodation of rapid safe accommodation of cyclists by Mobicon, done out of the Berlin case. And they take a lot of concepts of, say, it's not just enough to give them space. There's principles on how to do it safely. They've been incorporated in the guidelines. You can grab that guide and kind of assess which ones can be permanent and which ones shouldn't be, and which can be if they need a bit more work. Yeah.
Right. Robin, Craig's talked a lot about the physical. We've talked a lot more about the physical changes that have been made. Obviously, I mean, some of the changes I've seen, you know, it really makes that streetscape much more human friendly, a gathering spot, you know, has that more feeling of that pedestrians and cyclists should be there, are welcome there. You know, what are some of those, you know, maybe not so much on the built perspective of it, but from a psychological perspective, you know, Craig was talking about being safe. There's the safety in terms of that I've got that separation, but there's also, even though there are some places that are safe, people don't feel safe there. There's the perception aspect that we need to deal with as well.
Sorry, are you talking about the perception of the people using the infrastructure as pedestrians and cyclists, or the drivers? Oh,
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is all speculation. I haven't done research specifically on that, but I think thinking about, if we're talking about the short term, like during the pandemic, I think we probably shouldn't make these places that attractive, if that makes sense, because there could be some novelty aspect to it that would just draw people out if we're trying to discourage gathering. And I think some cities, mistakenly have opened some streets, but done so in a way that it makes these open streets a destination as opposed to a just basic utility. And I think to address that, you know, obviously use the proper materials to indicate to drivers that these structures are there. But at the same time, I think these open streets should be open across our cities and in a network manner, so that it's easily accessible by everyone, it's seen as just as an amplification of already existing infrastructure that just isn't adequate enough to allow people to physically distance appropriately. In the long term, I think it's a huge opportunity to beautify our streets. You know, I think it was Rachel that mentioned just how much space is allocated to streets in our cities. I'd seen a figure for the City of London in the UK that said 80% of London's public space is its street space, and which is pretty interesting to think about. There's a pretty dense city and the streets are narrow, and even then it takes up a significant amount of what we consider to be public space. And so, you know, I think in terms of the long-term implications, if we were to make these changes permanent, how can we do so in a way that beautifies the street? You know, maybe we can use, like many cities have in the past, you know, planters. Can we work with local public artists to, you know, use color and make these vibrant places that people want to use? Because the really cool thing to me about cycling infrastructure, and I've seen, you know, in my own travels, is that beyond its utility in keeping people safe, it can add a level of aesthetic appeal or attractiveness or beauty. And I think beauty in urban context is increasingly important. You know, we have park space and public art, but I think there's a way to marry all three of these ideas around, you know, transportation infrastructure, green space, and art. And I think there's a huge opportunity in front of us here.
Yeah, I think there's so much to consider. You know, when you think about, you know, Craig, you mentioned, you know, the different resources that are out there for various people who are interested. Mostly, I would think some of those resources would be targeted towards professionals. But do you have, maybe Craig, I'll ask you to comment on this first, you know, some ideas about how do we mobilize and advocate for some of these changes in cities in North America, in Canada and the US, you know, that, and this would include the experts, but also, you know, the other residents that may not have a background in this area or a topic. How do we galvanize them to understand what is and isn't possible, and to affect long-term change?
Sure, I'll speak to the professional aspect first, and then maybe the layperson. I think for professionals, data and case studies can be really powerful. And so there's one thing that we're trying to help with where we can, in that a lot of times when a new high profile bike lane is getting put in, we may actually measure the safety of it. We were talking about the perception of safety, and there's going to be a lot of people who, you know, because they're motivated, that not want to have that bike lane, will say that's not safe. You know, I'm driving here and I almost hit these cyclists because it's unsafe, and I don't want blood on my hands, and get this bike lane out of here, right? And can make a big noise of it without a lot of data. And when you have data that says, you know what, we measured, you know, the risks before and after the bike lane went in, and here's exactly how many near misses happen, exactly the risk levels, the speeds, the conflicts at turning points, and all that stuff. And if you can actually show that it's quite safe, or that it was mostly safe and there was some residual risk that you did some tweaks and then it became safe, mm-hmm. that can really powerfully answer the question. And then that person at that city can share it with the next city over, who's about to go through the same challenge and the same public opposition and everything like that. So there's all kinds of interesting projects going on. Like, so if you're in one city, you know, get the examples from other cities. For the public, I think just being clear about your preferences, and sharing examples. If you go on a trip and you love something that you saw in Montreal, you know, see if you can share that with the people who are running things in your city. The city of Montreal, this is not really in response to COVID, but they have something coming in this summer called the Réseau Express Vélo, and it's 10 kilometers across the island. They're reallocating a full lane in each direction to bicycles 3 meters wide in each direction. And this is going to be a really unique project. And if you want to, well, we're not doing travel right now, but if you live somewhere else and you get some pictures of that and you share a link locally and it can inspire your local city, that something like that can be done very successfully.
Yeah, Rachel, the ability for us to impact the positive changes that could be implemented permanently in the cities. I see a lot of conversation on social media, in regular media, that more people who are both working in this area, but also residents that are living in these areas are just really interested in these conversations. How do we? Do you have any ideas in terms of how we make sure that they know, as Craig described, that they need to speak up and tell those decision makers and people who are planning these things what they like and what they'd like to keep?
Yeah, well, I think in many cities there's various coalitions of, sort of bike coalitions or folks that are particularly interested in transit, and I think those groups can be really helpful. And I think what often happens in cities is, change is hard, and it feels like the pandemic has maybe, unleashed the appetite for change a little bit. But, as you said, whether or not that change can be sustained is to be seen. And I think it's really important for people to, if you like a change, to come out in favor of it, and not, there'll be lots of voices in opposition, because it forces people to do things or to think differently. But those positive voices, and really having the back of transportation departments that are making courageous choices and making decisions about we're going to make these changes permanent. That's really important too. And proactively pushing those things forward, electing city leaders or selecting city leaders that are going to be more progressive on these issues. And importantly, from my perspective, really engaging the private sector. Businesses are important voices in the conversation. There's a lot that developers can do. In Europe, you see it takes everybody to build out these really seamless and comprehensive biking networks. It's not just about the public infrastructure. You go to a shopping mall, or you go to a grocery store, and there's a ton of bicycle infrastructure there. You have an apartment complex, there's lots of bike storage. So, getting that private sector engagement and buy-in and making those investments over time are also really important. And I'll just say, I think in addition to these sort of more revolutionary tweaking that's happening now, there's a lot of work that has been going on this, what I might call like sort of bread and butter regulatory issues around transportation that I hope will still continue. Changes to parking requirements, for example, making it possible to build development with less parking, changing the use of level of service evaluations for roads, so that you're not sort of building excess road capacity, streamlining the process for permitting for sidewalk uses or for food trucks, just building in more flexibility into the public space and maybe rolling back some of those regulations that aren't useful anymore. I think that the sort of day-to-day work of reforming transportation policies in cities needs to continue as we go.
Thanks. Yeah, Robin, the work that you've been doing, with virtual reality, sometimes people need to see what they can experience before, and I think that's part of what we're seeing now is people are actually getting a taste of what could be permanent. Is there any, from your perspective, is there a role for that kind of, virtual reality, the sort of experiential piece that will contribute to the maybe advocacy or people getting involved with their communities longer term?
I think as much as I love virtual reality, it's not accessible to everybody. There is utility in that, but I think mostly for research. And I know some planners and urban designers and different firms are using VR to help clients see what something could look like, and it's been used in planning and consultation. But I actually think that the best way of giving people a taste of what is actually being proposed is, like you said, building these pilots out. A few years ago, it was 2014, I think, 2015. I was part of a small group of people, advocates in Edmonton, and there was at that time Edmonton didn't have too much cycling infrastructure, and so there was the downtown 102nd Ave bike lane, which has since been built, but it was not prioritized too high in the city's capital budget, and I think accordingly and appropriately, people were pretty frustrated with that, and we were trying to figure out ways to communicate to the people who were making decisions about this that we wanted that there. And we came up with the idea of doing a pop-up bike lane which spanned 10 blocks, and the majority of what was to be proposed, and it just took some flower planters and some pylons, and we got it up and brought it down within 5 hours. But it was fascinating because it was, I think the drivers figured it out, we cyclists figured it out. Everyone seemed to be able to navigate that space. And I know there's probably some important things I'm missing that Craig's probably more an expert on when it comes to things like sight lines and whatnot. But in terms of just that 4 or 5 hour span of time, I think people were really able to see what it is that they were objecting to. And I think that, again, with this, what the trends that we're seeing during this pandemic, the bike shop, like my sister's partner is a rep for a bike company, and he's been the busiest he's ever been. The shops can't keep stock of the stuff that he is selling. And, we've got a bunch of new cyclists out on the road, and obviously most of them are probably doing it for recreational and leisure purposes. But, I think through that, people who typically probably drive and had negative feelings about cyclists, often that's stoked by, the media for their own purposes to create conflict when they're probably having a slow news day. But, it's this, I think we'll be seeing some shifts in the perspective. This is all about perspective taking. And if you typically drive and have had to ride a bike in your community because that's the only way that you can keep sane during these really challenging times, I think there's a lot of potential here to change minds. And so accordingly, to keep people, or to show people, who are new cyclists, what is possible, build the infrastructure quickly, let them have a taste for it. And they might say, hey, actually, like, I can bike to work in 15 minutes, whereas driving takes 10, but I spend 20 minutes finding parking. All these small things that can nudge people into these different behaviors should be considered.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Craig, Robin touched on the technology, the use of technology. So, I've seen a number of things like that the COVID-19 crisis has brought forward of pedestrians not having to push the walk button when they get to the intersection. There's a number of these, video analytics and things like that you talked about earlier. What role could and should technology actually play in the planning to look at infrastructure and road safety, and how do Canadian cities innovate responsibly to build this kind of technology into their strategies?
So yeah, it's a good question. Robin was talking about that Edmonton bike corridor, and we were able to measure that at post installation with our video analytics to document every near miss that was happening on it, and that in itself was technology playing a role in helping make it permanent. I think that technology in general offers a lot of promise. So most cities have a department within their traffic section called something like Intelligent Transportation Systems. Mm-hmm. And they're eager to try all kinds of different technological solutions. This one about pedestrians not having to push the button, that's a big deal for traffic engineers. because if you give a walk phase to the pedestrians, okay, you have to allow enough seconds for a slow pedestrian to cross the street. And that's gonna increase overall intersection delay, right? And so their preference is to only give the walk phase when it's called for with the button. When traffic comes back, the backups are gonna be worse because of that, and there's gonna be pressure to put it back. So they didn't really do that with a technological solution. They just reprogrammed it to give the walk phase every single time. Okay. But a technological solution would be to have a sensor that sees that a pedestrian is there and gives the walk phase or gives a longer phase. So those are there, they exist, and then you can kind of balance it. You don't have to sabotage the vehicle phase if it's not necessary, because the pedestrians are not there. And when they're there, you give them the call. There's the same thing for bikes. Some technologies will say, you know, when the light turns yellow and then red, like that's traditionally timed to give enough time for a car who started crossing the intersection to finish, right? And some cyclists may be comfortably finish in the same time before cross-street traffic is released. Others may not, right? So if you have some technology that detects that a bike is there and trying to finish a crossing, after it goes to yellow and it goes to red, it may just lock all directions on red to let that cyclist clear out before it releases the green for the cross-street traffic. So technologies like that, and of course I'm really biased towards our own technology because I think that, I mean, Parachute is it's about injury prevention, and I take an evidence-based approach to injury prevention. And without technology, it's just very hard to gather that evidence. So the non-technology-based approach is these crash records that police kind of half-heartedly fill out. Sometimes, some of them are great. I don't want to disparage them, but oftentimes it's half-heartedly filled out because they have very important other priorities to take care of and very low sample sizes. So try and take some kind of evidence-based epidemiological approach to injury prevention, especially when the treatments are so new and we don't have time for the data to accumulate. Right. That's our technological contribution, and we want to help more and more cities with that, which we are, and we're excited about the power to predict and prevent crashes, using video analytics.
Yeah, I think that's an area that a lot of people are interested in. Rachel and Rob and I have one more question for each of you, and then we'll switch over to the Q&A. So Rachel, switching gears a little bit, we have conversations starting as restrictions are lifted of people not wanting to take public transit after the pandemic. So we have this potential for people who used to commute by train or bus switching to their vehicles, and a lot of single occupancy vehicles now hitting the road to move around. How do we plan for this? And is there a way that we can help influence some of those road users not to go back to their or not to use their car? Are there some solutions that you have?
Yeah, I think the transit picture is really troubling. I think, transit, the fares, fare boxes are down, and ridership is down and is likely to remain so even when, sort of business starts to return to normal. I think people will still be worried about riding transit. But I think the solution really can't be that we just surrender city streets to automobiles, including those driven by suburban drivers. So we need to find a balance and find innovative solutions. Regional trail systems, park and ride lots where people could park their car and bike into the city if there's a bike lane there. More streets dedicated to biking and walking, as we've talked about, more micro-mobility options like scooters to allow people to circulate within cities. And we really need to prioritize retrofitting buses and trains to help keep them safe, both from an operational perspective and a design perspective. So barriers between riders and bus drivers, backboarding, as some buses and trains are doing, enhanced cleaning protocols, Rider behavior is really important, so wearing masks to help prevent the spread of disease to others, increasing bus frequency to prevent crowding, and increasing speed. A lot of cities have made sort of half-hearted investments in rapid bus and BRT-like systems, and so accelerating those to help move bus riders more quickly and decrease the crowding on buses will be really important. More information. So I think, I guess one hopeful thing is I think there are some transit systems that are using this downtime to really make investments in their capital, to accelerate upgrades to stations and to the tracks. I know in DC WMATA is doing that so that when ridership comes back online, they'll be better and more reliable than ever. But I think in the short term, really thinking about what transit needs and how to protect transit operators is really key. And I'd also say, I think people are also sort of thinking about taxis and ride sharing and what happens there. And I think, that's another important piece of this overall transportation picture. And the same things apply. We really have to make sure that measures are being taken to protect the drivers and to help keep people safe as cities come back online.
Robin, switching gears a little bit again, we've talked a lot about roadways and people using roadways, but they're going certain places to, at the end of those trips. You wrote an article in April for the Huffington Post calling for open parks and to trust Canadians to social distance. Why is this important in terms of health equity? And what considerations do we need to be thinking about for those public spaces, parks, the destinations where people are going as we move forward, in addition to this road safety question?
Well, that article was really inspired by my contemplating how to make this sustainable from a mental health perspective for people. There's studies coming out almost every week, most of which are suggesting we're going to be in some sort of social or physical distancing requirement until 2022. It's a long time. And the bearability of that is really going to depend on the privilege of the people, how much interior space do they have to occupy? Do they have private backyard green space that they can access? And the reality is that there are huge disparities in our cities when it comes to access, when it comes to space. Typically, if you were to use an intersectional approach, race and class intersect. And so, poor people of color or poor people will have to rely more on park space just to get some reprieve from the probably already confined spaces that they live in. I think that a lot of the conversation that I've seen has around, public space is that it should be policed. People should receive fines if they use public space. And if you were to, obviously not everyone who are in parks are living under the poverty line, but a lot of people who live under the poverty line will need park space. And if we find them, there was someone in Ottawa, I think, that got an $880 ticket for walking his dog through a park. That's extremely concerning. People who already live in financial precarity are going to be hit with other things that just continue to push them in the other direction and make these disparities larger. And I think something else to consider is, I know, in Canada, particularly in Toronto, you've got a significant issue with carding. Desmond Cole, was a reporter in Toronto, an activist in Toronto, has raised the issue of the fact that Black people are disproportionately affected by carding practices where they're just basically stopped and frisked within the context of a pandemic where, based on someone's judgment and informed by their bias, I'm a little scared to think what could happen if we start really trying to police this pandemic as opposed to use a proactive measure. And so those proactive measures, I think, are increasing road space or space on roads for people to get outside and keeping parks open. And I think that if we give people more space, the likelihood for them to congregate in smaller parks will decrease. And again, trying to ensure that, the next pandemic that's going to hit, if we keep this up, is we're going to have a mental health epidemic. We already are in one. Mental health issues are on the rise, and this pandemic, I'm worried, is going to exacerbate that. And within that mental health epidemic that already exists, people of color are already disproportionately affected. So I think we need a bit of a more of a comprehensive and a systems approach that takes equity into account when we're making our decisions.
Great, thanks. I'm going to invite my colleague, Kelly, to come in. She's been monitoring the questions that have been being asked and see what our participants have been taking from this discussion and what they want to know from each of you. So Kelly, over to you.
Okay, a few specific questions. One on, we've talked about some of these examples from Europe, but given Canada's climate, how does that hinder efforts to make cities more bike and pedestrian friendly?
So, go ahead.
Yeah, I think winter being used as an excuse as for us not to have cycling infrastructure. People ski in the winter; they can ride a bike too. And I've went to the last two winter cycling conferences, and we've got representatives from all over the world. Or one of whom is from Oulu in Finland, where I think the average winter temperature is -30, and kids bike to school year round because there's adequate cycling infrastructure. So, Canadians are hardy folks. We get out, we shovel the sidewalks. I think if we give people the space to do it safely, we'll see people choosing cycling more. So I think it's more of a mentality than it is a reality. Obviously, there are some days that no one should be outside at all. It's like -50, but for the majority of our winters, I think it's reasonable to expect that people will ride their bikes.
Okay. A follow-up to that, another participant mentioned that their community is an older community with many seniors. So with seniors' mobility issues, these are not people who are going to be hopping on their bikes. They are people who will be seeking handicap parking near where they want to go. So how, again, do we do this kind of changing the road use for more active transportation for people who cannot avail themselves of active transportation, specifically seniors?
Yeah, Rachel, did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. We have adopted the idea of, making sure that everybody living in urban America has access to a high quality park within a 10-minute walk. So that's pretty close. That would be accessible probably to people with, just some limited mobility. I think for those folks that really can't move very much, some other kinds of solutions might need to be developed. I think in this country and probably in Canada too, this lack of mobility can become sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like, we build these cities that are really only navigable by car, and then people need to use cars to get around them, and then they gradually lose their ability to kind of move in other ways. And when you go to Europe, you see all these little grannies riding their bikes and going around. And so, recognizing that people have mobility issues now and really do need to have access to those spaces, we need to be mindful of the sort of longer term effects of those kinds of decisions on the way that people can age. And I also think, I've seen some articles about the way that we're building communities and making people so dependent on cars has led to, so many seniors being in these long-term care facilities, and then increasing their vulnerability to things like the coronavirus. So really building communities that people with a range of different mobility levels can navigate is really important.
Another question, somewhat related, is around the topic of school zones. We're seeing a lot of discussion about how we're going to change our downtowns. Has anybody heard of any initiatives about making school zones where vehicle traffic is forbidden so that it is an active transportation zone coming out of these discussions?
Craig, did you want to take that one?
Yeah, I saw the question. I wish I had a direct example to give. lots of work has been done around safe routes to school, limiting where people can go, like preventing going into parking lots and stuff like that. Making a whole street car free. I haven't heard of that. I'd be happy for someone to type in the comments and hear about it if it has happened. I mean, you need an equity lens there too, right? Some people need to get to school who dropped off by vehicle. You know, there's kids that go to school that can't walk or bike. So, you know, you need that consideration as well.
Great. Kelly, one quick question and then we'll have to wrap up.
All right. I would say the last one would be, someone asks, are we just participating here in an echo chamber? Is this about people who have always wanted to increase cycling and pedestrian space now taking their moment to push for their agenda? How much real public support for this? How much is it just us talking to each other, or is there any evidence at all of a true public groundswell wanting more space dedicated to active transportation?
I'll open that up. Anyone want to take that one?
I'll have a quick answer for it. I don't think, I'm not implying that there's a larger demand. What I'm implying is that we're seeing more people out on their bikes and walking in our communities, and that there is perhaps an opportunity to make it easier for those people who've newly joined the ranks of the cyclist to get around their cities more safely. So yeah, I personally can't make any assumptions about this greater demand, but we're seeing it in our newspapers. We're seeing more people, you know, vote with their bikes or their feet or their mobility devices out in our communities. And I think there's a big opportunity there.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I mean, I think, you know, I think that I don't know if I've seen like national polling on support for bike lanes and things like that, but, you know, when you look at the market evidence, you know, places that are more compact, bikeable, walkable, mixed use, you know, those have been steadily increasing in price over the past few decades. And if people are sort of voting with their wallets for the kinds of places like that, you know, I think that's pretty strong evidence. And the problem is, you know, there's just not the supply. And so that demand really drives up prices and makes it sort of a premium and less accessible to folks who can't afford it. So, you know, building more of those kinds of places will help to satisfy that demand.
Great, thanks. So we're just a couple minutes over time, and I know there's still a lot of people online, and I think that's a recognition of how interested people are in this conversation and the fact that there's now the space to talk about this. So I want to thank all three of you, Rachel, Craig, Robin, thank you so much for coming on and talking to us today, and to all of the participants who joined us. I know it's Friday afternoon, so we were happy to have you join us. And again, thanks to our partners at Desjardins Insurance. This will be recorded, and you'll be able to share this or review it. And I know that we are looking forward to our next panel, which we haven't settled on yet, but we will be letting people know what that looks like shortly. So thanks everybody, and have a wonderful weekend.
Thanks a lot.